Well, welcome to session 4 of our series that began with the COVID-19 influx. We're entitling it The Beginning of the Showdown, meaning, of course, the showdown between God and Pharaoh. Now, you recall when we ended last session, it was at the end of chapter 5, and Moses had just started making charges against God, saying, God, everything's going downhill, everything's going bad, and it is your fault. Well, if you have your Bible handy, open it to chapter 6 of Exodus. We're going to move from chapter 5 into chapters 6 and 7 in this session. Now, recall that God seemed not to have argued with Moses. He didn't question Moses' charges, except when we move now into chapter 6, we're going to find that that's changing. God's going to tell him, okay, it's time. Come on, Moses, let's go. Starting in verse 1, Then the Lord said to Moses, Now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh. For with a strong hand, and that's God's strong hand, with my strong hand, he will release them, the Israelites, and with a strong hand, he will drive them out of his land. What was God saying? Well, he's saying this, hey, Moses, when I lift my strong hand against Moses, he's going to buckle. Not only will he allow the Hebrews out of Egypt, he will drive them out. He'll be glad to get rid of all of you. Well, that wasn't a new revelation to Moses. God had told him that before. Now, in verses 2 and through 5 here in chapter 6, God is going to remind Moses of all the things he had told him before. Some of those things, for example, who was God? What had God done for them before? What had God seen in the way of the suffering of the Israelites? And what had he promised them through the Abrahamic covenant? Those are things that God pointed out to Moses in those 4 verses. Now, in the next 3, God is going to make 7, count them, 7 promises to the Hebrews. And all 7 in the Hebrew would be understood to be in the past tense, just as if God said, hey, my promises, consider it done. Now, in the 7 verses from verse 2 through verse 8, God uses an important phrase 4 times. That phrase is, I am the Lord. And it's going to be a phrase he teaches to the Egyptians eventually. Now, the first occurrence of that was back in verse 2, which we didn't read. You can read that, and you see it there. But now, beginning in verse 6, we're going to see some further use of that term. And again, remember, he's making here 3 promises, all related to deliverance and redemption. Watch them. Therefore, in verse 6, therefore say to the Israelites, I am the Lord. There's that important phrase. First promise, I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. Second promise, I will rescue you from the hard labor they impose. Third promise, I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgments. God is continually reminding the Israelites that he will judge Egypt. Now, the next 2 promises are for the Hebrews people, as a people. He's saying, look, you guys are Pharaoh's slaves, but I'm going to adopt you You will become my children, my chosen nation. And that's where he's going to go in verse 7. He says, I will take you, first promise, I will take you to myself for a people. Second promise, when I do, I will be your God. Then you will know that, here it comes, I am the Lord, your God, who brought you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. Now, in the final two promises in verse 8, God is going to validate his covenant promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Verse 8, first promise, I will bring you to the land I swore to give to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And second promise, I will give it to you as a possession. I am the Lord. And as we closed last session, we were noting that the Jews were beginning to get downtrodden a bit. Evidently, Pharaoh's tactics of giving them more work, making them scatter out to find straw for the bricks, were not allowing them an opportunity to coalesce as a unit. And in verse 9, which we read last time, we're going to repeat it here, Moses told this, that is all the stuff we just mentioned, all these promises, but they, the Israelites, did not listen to him because of their discouragement and hard labor. Now, that word discouragement is a pretty mild translation. What the Hebrew actually meant was shortness of breath. And that shortness of breath is a shortness that comes when you're under extreme stress, extreme duress, and a good picture of that would be a child sobbing so hard they're gasping for breath. They can't breathe, they're crying so hard. That's the strength of the picture that's being shown here. Now, that seems to have put Moses back into his mode of making excuses. We don't know why he's back in that mode. Maybe it was because of the lack of response on the part of the Israelites. We just don't know. Maybe he was beginning to question his own ability. We're just speculating. But the Lord said to Moses in verse 10, go tell Pharaoh, king of Egypt, that he must release the Israelites from his land. But Moses responded to the Lord. Here goes his excuse. If the Israelites didn't listen to me, how will Pharaoh listen to me, since I speak with difficulty? In the Hebrew, speak with difficulty actually means I speak with uncircumcised lips. That's an interesting analogy. Jeremiah used it in 6:10. He said, to whom shall I speak and give a warning that they may hear? Behold, their ears are uncircumcised. They can't listen. Behold, the word of the Lord is to them an object of scorn, and they take no pleasure in it. And in 9:26, he also says, Egypt, Judah, Edom, the sons of Ammon, Moab, all who dwell in the desert, who cut the corners of their hair, for all these nations are uncircumcised, and all the house of Israel are uncircumcised in heart. Wow. It's clear you're not going to circumcise an ear. You're not going to circumcise some lips. You're not going to circumcise your heart. What must he be meaning? Well, the term uncircumcised generally refers to unbelief or disobedience with respect to the things of God. And when that goes on long enough, hearts become hardened. That's the danger of steadfast opposition to the things of God. Now, in the case of Moses' lips, it likely meant that he denied being able to speak proficiently, fluently. That was important in Egypt. But we know that that might be an excuse because in Acts 7, remember, Stephen said, Moses was powerful in word and deed. Well, the narrative is going to move to a heightened state of confrontation. It's going to be the introduction that leads to the plagues that God's going to inflict on Israel. But as a transition, kind of interesting, Moses sticks in here a short genealogy, all of the begets that people like to skip. And that short genealogy runs from verses 13 to 27. And then he gives a very brief, up-to-date review in 28, 29, and 30. But interestingly, in that short, I started to say resume, but in that short genealogy, there are several things of interest. Number one, only 3 of the 12 sons of Jacob are mentioned. All 3 are sons of Leah, and they are Reuben, the firstborn, Simeon, and Levi, which is rather interesting because Reuben lost his firstborn birthright because of an immoral act with his father's concubine. That's in Genesis 35:22, if you need to refresh yourself as to what that situation was. But he was notorious for that. Well, Simeon and Levi were notorious for something else, just as notorious. It was what I've called the Shechem incident, which, remember, one of the leading sons of a Shechem resident raped their sister Dinah, and they took vengeance in a very seedy, devious way and brought reproach upon all of the Hebrews in the region. You can read about that in Genesis 34. Also interesting, Simeon and Levi, their descendants were the 2 tribes that did not receive 1 square foot of land as an inheritance in the promised land. They got nothing. Simeon's people ended up living in the confines of the region of Judah. Levi, remember, his descendants, God became their inheritance. They were made into the priests and the Levite workers in the temple and so forth. Well, what about Moses and Aaron? Were they highborn? Does their resume or their genealogy make them look good? Well, probably not. As Jews or as Israelites, they were not born of Reuben. They were not born as descendants of the firstborn. So they go down a notch. Not only that, as Levites, as descendants of Levi, they weren't even descendants of Levi's firstborn son, Gershon. Now that was a big deal, being the firstborn in Israel at that time. And they were actually descended, Moses and Aaron were, from Kohath, the second son of Levi. But it even gets more interesting because Moses, as the son of Amram, was not the firstborn. Aaron was the firstborn, but Moses was the one chosen. So out of the genealogies, I think you can get several interesting things. Number one, a takeaway is that when you look at a genealogy, there are going to be important information within those genealogies. And even if it's not terribly important to you personally, it can be interesting. For example, in that same genealogy, there's a reference to Moses' mother, Jochebed. You remember Jochebed hiding Moses when he was a child and so forth. Well, do you know that Jochebed was also Moses' great aunt? Moses' father, Amram, married his own father's sister. Amram married his aunt, making Jochebed Moses' great aunt, as well as his mother. Well, there's a second takeaway from genealogies, and that is when we look at this one, for example, you see that God made a choice of Moses, but it certainly was not based on anything in Moses' pedigree. If you think you don't have a pedigree that qualifies you to do service for God, you are mistaken. Pedigree is not his primary concern. Now let's move into chapter 7 and beginning in verse 1, see what's happening now. So the Lord said to Moses, "See, I have made you like God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron will be your prophet." Remember what he said earlier to Aaron? He said, or to Moses at least, Aaron, will speak for you, Moses. He will speak for you to the people, and it will be as if he were your mouth, and as if you were his God. Interesting. That was in Exodus 4:16, by the way. So think about it. What is a prophet? Is he anything more than a mouthpiece for God? Mouthpiece doesn't seem to cut it, does it? In the same way, Aaron is a mouthpiece for Moses, therefore his prophet. But Moses, as God to Pharaoh, is a completely different matter. That refers to the fact that Moses was going to be wielding God's authority and God's power as God's representative before Pharaoh. Apparently, however, Pharaoh wasn't intimidated by that. He wasn't worried about whether Moses was God's agent or not. Because remember, he didn't even think Moses' God was anything to be concerned about. He says, "Who is your God, Moses?" Well, let's go to verse 2. And he's going to continue giving instructions to Moses. "You are to speak all that I command you, and your brother Aaron is to speak to Pharaoh." There's the prophet-like action, "that he must release the Israelites from his land." But take a peek at this next verse 3. "But I will harden Pharaoh's heart. Although I will multiply my signs and my wonders in the land of Egypt," I'm going to do all these miracles right in front of Pharaoh. "Pharaoh will not listen to you. I will reach myself into Egypt and bring out my regiments, my people, the Israelites, from the land of Egypt with," and here we go again, "great acts of judgment." So God said, Pharaoh's slaves are going to become my people, the same promise he had made earlier. And his miracles, or the plagues, would be used to prove who Yahweh was to the Egyptians. But let's take a moment and discuss that notion of Pharaoh's hardened heart. In verse 3, of course, God said, "I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart." Well, if God makes Pharaoh's heart hard so that Pharaoh will not listen to reason, doesn't that absolve Pharaoh? It wasn't his fault. God did it, didn't he? Well, that's not really the case. Consider something that Moses said a little bit later, and here I'm going to ratchet forward to Exodus 9:34, a couple chapters down the pike. And it says, "When Pharaoh saw that the rain and hail and thunder ceased." Now, this is in the middle of one of those plagues, the wonders that God is performing. Right in the middle of it, when it was over, Pharaoh sinned again. Both he and his servants hardened their hearts. So what does that say? Well, it says that Pharaoh hardened his own heart. So what is it? Did God harden Pharaoh's heart? Did Pharaoh harden Pharaoh's heart? Isn't that the two a contradiction among each other? Well, not really, unless you insist on it. The hardness of heart refers to a fixed opposition to the things of God. Remember, we talked about uncircumcised hearts, our hearts that resist God, disobedient to God. Well, if that continues for any period of time, a stubborn resistance to the things of God, then your heart becomes hardened. So what happened in this case? God didn't really cause Pharaoh's heart to be hardened, except that he provided all of the opportunities by which Pharaoh could have chosen for him or against him. And in every case, Pharaoh chose against him. So Pharaoh, out of his own free will, out of his own choices, made the decision to oppose God. No, Pharaoh's not absolved of his responsibility. Again, he acted stubbornly in his own free will. Now, in verse 4, what did God say was his goal in all of these great acts of judgment? Why was he going to do the judging of Israel, or the judging of Egypt, rather? For one reason, to bring his people out of bondage. That was the primary reason. But there was a second reason, and we can see that in verse 5 of chapter 7. Then the Egyptians, that's after God does all of those wonders, Pharaoh hardens his heart, goes in opposition to God. God says, then the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. There's our phrase again. When I extend my hand over Egypt and bring out the Israelites from among them, they're going to know Yahweh is the God of Israel. And Moses then began to obey God's instructions a little more seriously, it seems to me, in verse 6. And Moses and Aaron did so. They did what God said. They did just as the Lord commanded them. Now, Moses was 80 years old, and Aaron was 83. Remember, Aaron was the firstborn 3 years before Moses. And when they were speaking to Pharaoh, that's how old they were. Now, it says, what's next? Well, we're about to get into the nitty-gritty of the judgments that God's going to bring. The next scene will end our session, and it will set the stage for the plagues that are going to follow in the future sessions. Let's look at verse 8. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, when Pharaoh says to you, do a miracle. Hey, remember, Pharaoh essentially told Moses, who's your God? So now he may be making fun of Moses and daring him to show a miracle. We don't really know that that's the case, but certainly sounds reasonable. So when Pharaoh says to you, do a miracle, and you say to Aaron, take your rod and throw it down before Pharaoh. The rod, remember, also is called a staff in many places. But when you throw it down before Pharaoh, it'll become a snake. So when Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh, they did so, just as the Lord had commanded them. Aaron threw down his rod before Pharaoh and his servants, and the rod became a snake. Well, the term snake there is a little bit of an understatement. The snake, really, the term tannin, T-A-N-N-I-N, that's translated snake there, was in fact meant to mean the great serpent. Leviathan, great monster, crocodile is translated in various ways. And so that's what we're dealing with. Evidently, this was quite a snake. Well, in verse 11, we see that Pharaoh, though, wasn't really intimidated. He says, okay, let's go at it. So then Pharaoh summoned his wise men, his sorcerers, and his magicians, those of Egypt. By their secret arts, they did the same things. That is, they appeared to turn rods into snakes. Now, we probably realize they most likely didn't, but they had that effect, that it looked like they had imitated that miracle of turning a rod into a snake. Each man of Pharaoh threw down his rod, and the rods became snakes. But Aaron's rod swallowed up their rods. Interesting. I don't think Pharaoh was expecting that. Now, we don't really know, again, how the sorcerers did these things. May have been some form of magic, sleight of hand is faster than the eye, some form of snake charming. They were known in some cases to be able to make a snake go into a rigid form where they could hold it by the nape of the neck and it looked like they had a rod or a staff in their hands. So it could have been some form of snake charming or some satanic supernatural activity. We don't really know. But the key is relatively simple. Pharaoh rejected it. He was perhaps buoyed up or strengthened by the work of his sorcerers. We don't know. But Pharaoh wasn't bullied by the action of Aaron's snake. Some joker retorted that whatever happened, the sorcerers went home without their rods. Well, jokes aside, in verse 13 we see the result. Yet Pharaoh's heart became hard. He did not listen to them just as the Lord had predicted. The Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh's heart is hard. He refuses to listen to the people. So again, Pharaoh's heart became hard as a consequence of his repeated and freely chosen stubborn opposition to God. In everything, it's kind of interesting. Everything is going according to God's plan now. Pharaoh says no, but God says, now I've got Pharaoh right where I want him. The stage was set. The fireworks were about to begin. And in next session, we'll be in the middle of all of the